Well, at this time, I want us to hear our history bit on today. Each Shabbat, as we gather, we make it a point to provide Zion with a history bit. We believe it's important that the people of Elohim be informed concerning the history of their faith and to have a well-rounded knowledge of information that has occurred in the past. Today, I want to share something about the Apocrypha and its removal from the English Bibles. In the 20th and 21st century, which most of us are familiar with, in the Western world, the Bibles that we have do not contain what is commonly called the Apocrypha. Now, when one hears the term Apocrypha, especially those that have been raised in Christian religious frameworks of the Western Protestant community, the term Apocrypha has a negative connotation to it because the word Apocrypha has been attached to a particular set of books that came to be regarded as not having divine inspiration. However, in the early centuries of the Messianic Israelite faith, the term Apocrypha was not used for those particular books that have been removed from the scriptures. But with that being said, it's important to note that these books that have come to be known as the Apocrypha were of great importance and significance in the English Bibles. The English Bibles, of course, being a product of the Protestant movement. For those of you who might not be familiar with the origins of the Protestant movement had its origins in Europe. That is the specific region where Protestantism developed. There were many individuals who were key in protesting, who were for a reforming of the Christian faith in response to the existing controlling Roman Catholic system that was and is in existence. And so reformers came up during the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s, and roughly in the 1500s, the Protestant movement began to really take shape and form and escape the control of the Roman Catholic power structure. Now, seeing that it developed in Europe, the Bibles that came to be produced in the language by those who predominantly spoke English continued to include the Apocrypha in them. Even though they had a separate section that they called the Apocrypha, they were still a part of those Bibles. Matter of fact, the original King James Version of 1611, in its title page of contents, it has the Apocrypha included. And the Apocrypha was so important to the people of that time that King James had made a law that if anyone was to even think about removing the books of the Apocrypha from the King James Bible in England, they would be arrested. So they had a very strong and significant place among the Protestants of the previous centuries. Matter of fact, in all of the English Bibles, you can look up the history of the English Bibles, whether it's Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, all of those Bibles, many of them that preceded the translation of the King James Version, and those that were developed after the King James Version, because, there were a number of versions of the English Bible that were produced other than the King James. So most people think that the only Bible that exists is the King James Bible. No, that just became a popular translation that became used. Initially, the King James Version was strictly used by the Church of England. But what we see here is that up until the 1880s, we find that all of the English Bibles contain the Apocrypha. So when we begin to consider that, we find that the understanding and the view that believers of that time period had towards the Apocryphal books were very different. And it wasn't until 1885, in the 1880s, that the English Standard Version was developed. And that was the first version that was produced that did not contain the Apocrypha. And then, of course, America began to follow suit and produce its Bible, and the Bible that America produced was called the American Standard Version. How many of y'all ever heard of that? And that particular Bible also did not include the Apocrypha. And that was done in 1901. Now, the King James Version, which had the Apocrypha books in its original translation, removed the Apocrypha some years earlier. Now, the reason behind why it was removed was a little different than the other translations that removed them. From what it appears, based upon the history that I've looked at here, that the Apocrypha was removed from the King James Version in 1828. And it was as a result of the National Bible Society of Scotland submitting a petition to the British and Foreign Bible Society to not include the Apocrypha in their production of these Bibles so as to become more cost effective. So basically, this is history.
Wow.
So basically, what happened is that as they were producing these Bibles, because you got to understand during that particular time in the world, the European world, in particular, England and Germany, these countries felt the need to provide the gospel to the entire world because they believed that the whole world outside of Europe needed to have the correct understanding of the Bible and presentation of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And of course, they believed that they were the ones to go and to missionize the world, but in their missionizing and in their evangelistic efforts, they were also Europeanizing many of the countries that they went to as they took these Bibles. Mm-hmm. So as a means of trying to be a little bit more cost effective, they figured, well, you know, the Apocrypha is not seen on the same par level as the other 66 books. So why don't we just eliminate them, save costs on printing, and send out those Bibles? So they had a different reason as to why. But with that change being made as we move into the 20th century, the new generation has a Bible in the Western world that they believe is the only inspired text of Scripture. As I have come to discover, the books that have been called the Apocrypha were not called the Apocrypha in earlier centuries, but were called the Deuterocanonical scriptures. And before they were called the Deuterocanonical scriptures, they were just included as part of the Torah, prophets, and the writings before the writings of the apostles had been collected. And so I hope that this information that we just shared regarding the Apocrypha and its removal from the English Bibles has helped us to see the scriptures a little differently. I trust that it has helped us to be able to do more investigation so that we can come to a more balanced perspective. Amen. Because in the Western Christian churches, which most of us are a product of because that's all that we know. Am I right? Mm-hmm. That's all that we know. They've told us that the Bible has only 66 books that are inspired. But if you went to the Eastern world and investigated the Orthodox churches, whether they are the Greek, Russian, or the Oriental Orthodox churches of India or Egypt or Ethiopia, what you will find is that those books that have been called the Apocrypha are indeed regarded by them as sacred scripture and canonized. And so I hope this information has been helpful. It is my desire to help Zion to reconnect with those things that our ancient Messianic Israelite predecessors held to be of great importance and significance. Yes. The Almighty be praised.